The wind in Peniche reached around 60 miles an hour. Yachts moored on the marina pontoons leaned in the gusts as if they were sailing. I chatted to the marina man, and he told me 5 years ago a section of the harbour mole was breached by the sea. Also, the main pontoon of the marina was destroyed by waves after breaking over the top of the mole, plunging across the car park, slipping down a concrete slope across 7 metres of water, and finally smashing the pontoon, a distance of approximately 60 metres from the massive sea defence, which was rows of interlocking concrete shapes with 3 prongs like jacks. Low scudding clouds eventually ceased and the sun shone warmly again. The forecast was for strong winds again. The French single-hander heading north wanted to sail to Brittany, his home. I thought it madness to consider such a voyage in the winter. I wouldn't even wish to be so intrepid. Other cruising friends talked of sailing throughout the winter, with plans to go to the Algarve and spend a month in the Rio Guadiana on the border between Spain and Portugal. A yacht could get 50 miles inland and reach Seville. I love the thought of cruising on a river for a long way inland. I needed to build a successful wind vane self-steering, then I could do things like that when I got underway again after the winter storms. On a ledge in the wall of the castle, above the retired fisherman who sat there every day, was a television. In the rain, a tabby cat curved around one corner and raised its tail in a homely manner. It was as if the television and the cat had been abstracted from some domestic sitting room and plonked there on the ledge in the castle wall. Around the corner, a pair of dogs, an Alsatian and a heavily built Labrador cross, were hunting a tabby cat on a ledge of the castle wall, where the sea enters a little cove surrounded by the fortification. The cat fled along a dead end, which petered out to a sheer rock face above the green, glooping waters. Ears pricked forward, tongues lolling, made several inroads to the ledge as the cat peered about for an escape route. The big dogs were unable to approach the cat closely due to the narrowing shelf. The third dog arrived, a much slimmer, lighter hound, and began to explore the ledge towards the cat. I told myself I was the dominant animal, and after several days of rain and gales, I'd gained a certain pent-up aggression which was looking for expression. I drew closer and stood taller. Psst! I told the dogs. I am coming! They turned towards me, the 2 larger ones sensing my body language and sauntered away. The thinner dog was still on the ledge with the cat, which was peering nervously out of long grass at the point where the shelf turned to a precipice. I told the dog, "Psst! Hey, come on now!" The dog looked between me and the cat, confused, and then came back off the ledge, probably realising I was going to place it in the very same position as it had the cat. I went for a coffee. Heavy rain came. A young child in the pasteleria was rewarded with a tube of Smarties for being funny and chatty by the woman serving. Someone passed a strongly egg-scented fart. The rain stopped. The butcher came in from his shop next door. I visited Cascades for a week to stay on Piece 4. A seagull deterrent consisted of a sound recording of a herring gull's alarm call, broadcast at unbearable decibels every 5 minutes, almost 24 hours a day. At some point a captive gull must have been tortured to make the recording. A single bird abused and recorded as a sacrifice to the thousands of gulls which would be harmlessly driven away. The sound became terribly aggravating, and I wanted to broadcast a horror movie soundtrack with blood-curdling screams outside the home of whoever invented the gull repellent. The Peniche feral cats could do with a similar system. They could have the sound of a dog being beaten, continuously playing at high volume. The gull deterrent was a main reason not to go to Cascades Marina. There were pleasant things in Cascades too, such as free bicycle hire, courtesy of the town council, while Cascades shopping would offer endless browsing in the music store. Peniche was overrun with gulls. Occasionally a large flock flew overhead, moving between feeding grounds. There were thousands, and it made a wondrous spectacle in the evening light, and their cries were from real gully beaks. The pontoon beside Storm Petrel was a night roost of 100 or so herring gulls. I did not mind the droppings, as the rain washed them away and the sun baked them to white powder. When I slid open the hatch in the early hours, the flock of gulls made a panicking, screaming warning noise amongst themselves, and then took off with the noise of their feathers pushing the air and their feet shoving away from the pontoon, very quietly, very closely. Two French boats arrived. One was a type which I had been interested in when looking for a cruising boat, an Arping by Dufour. It had a wide hull with narrow ends, typical of 1980s cruiser races. Looking at it again though, I was less keen on the overall design, which appeared more suited to weekend cruising. Closer to home, a thin, fin keel and unprotected spade rudder hung on a narrow skeg would be vulnerable to damage if it hit a reef or a container from a ship, and those were significant risks for a boat doing long offshore passages and entering unfamiliar areas. The second French yacht was a small, light, weekend cruiser built of plywood. It had been sailed to Madeira and was heading back to Brittany, which I considered near madness in December. The north of Portugal and Spain during the summer were mostly calm and forgiving, with fishing boats bobbing about on the swells, easily netting shoals of lazy sardines. A yacht could meander southwards, full of dreams and canned food from Asda. But the winter was cold, windy, and dangerous. Sailing across the Bay of Biscay was a great personal achievement, but it had to be a triumph of understanding rather than of hardiness. A feat of self-awareness rather than any form of conquest in the wilderness. At the point where I understood, or reasonably expected the conditions on the journey and the readiness of the boat would not prevent me from completing it, I set off. The preparation period was simply a matter of ensuring I had enough resources to keep sailing long enough to reach Spain, with some basic safety considerations, such as having an inflatable dinghy available in case the boat failed to keep the ocean out. The risk of being run down by a ship was calculated, and a kitchen timer used to allow 15 minutes of sleep. This was widely accepted as the time it would take a ship to travel from the horizon to your boat, as well as the minimum sleep period to be effective over a week or so. Each time the beeper sounded, I sprang out of my bunk and looked around the horizon for a careful couple of minutes. If the light of any vessel was visible, I remained on watch until it had passed over the horizon. If the light was a fishing boat, which often would remain in the area, I would sail the boat away until I was alone again. In the shipping lanes there were dozens of ships in sight at any one time. They passed in a line, each one a few miles behind the other, in both directions. This was a most difficult situation because the track of the ships was very similar to my own. I wanted to be away from the shipping lanes, but everyone was travelling between the same two corners of France and Spain. When the weather forecast warned of stronger winds to the west of my course, I veered further east into the Bay of Biscay, which was where I joined the straight line with all the ships. When I got to within 170 miles of Spain, I felt close enough to be able to spot the mountainous coast, but it would be a couple of days before I did see the land. With just 60 miles left, I felt close enough to touch land, and I was accompanied by an imaginary line of cliffs as I closed Spain at an angle. Each time I plotted my position on the chart, I realised land was still out of sight, but still I could not shake a mental model of the sea and land in which I was running along the coast quite close inshore. I reached a position 14 miles out to sea from La Coruna during darkness. This was ideal because it would enable me to safely approach land by daylight. However, I felt so near to the shore, I continued sailing towards the enticing harbour. I was overtired and became confused as to the exact position of La Coruna. My mental map and the chart did not seem to match. The GPS was indicating one heading and my senses were saying it was wrong. It was easy to believe the GPS was wrong because it only indicated the precise position of latitude and longitude which had been entered into it. It was an easy mistake to plot a position incorrectly on the chart and then enter the incorrect latitude and longitude. As I sailed, all the doubts weaved into the sureness which I felt in what I was doing, and this web bound me to the Spanish shores. It is doubt as much as competence which carries one towards a goal. The last of 7 nights alone on the ocean saw me confused and overtired, but how could I resist sailing to that Spanish shore, now just 14 miles away? I spent a day altering the self-steering wind vane, borrowing a round file from a Dutch boat and searching out my electric drill. I changed the wind vane pivot to reduce friction by making it swing on a stainless steel tube around a stainless steel stud. On the old version, the stud itself pivoted in the support pole. The fact the centre of balance of the wind vane and counterweight were not over the pivot point meant there was too much friction. Moving the pivot to a tube right between the vane and the counterweight significantly freed the pivot. A new plywood vane was cut to a shape resembling the wing of World War II Spitfire fighter airplane. I knew little about aerodynamics. I knew that the Spitfire functioned particularly well. A rectangle would probably work as well, but also lack elegance, and the wide outer end would be vulnerable to damage and gusts. The Spitfire wing provided an aesthetic form which was proven to be aerodynamic and durable. I redrew the rudder and trim tab design, simplifying materials and fabrication so the whole thing could be built by myself with local resources and without buying outside help. I was offered help with stainless steel welding, but then the Danish shipwright was unable to use a gas welding torch when the wind was strong, and then when the wind became light he was anxious to get off towards the Canary Islands, so he didn't end up helping me. The rudder could be hung on lashings. Piece 4, the Warren Catamaran, had 2 large rudders hung on lashings with a clever figure of 8, which gave easy, chafe-free movement with stability. Low technology can work very effectively and cost almost nothing. A number of holes and some lengths of light rope were all that was required. They were easy to make, and a sense of freedom from clearing away the usual way to do things and finding a simple method which works equally well and for almost no cost. A woman in a tweed jacket and a stylish hat spoke as she leant against the pasteleria counter smoking a cigarette. Why doesn't she speak Portuguese? I told her it was a difficult language for me because many words did not sound at all like the English or French equivalent. Table, la table, and chair, chaise, were easy to spot in French, and in Spanish, mesa is a table, so it can be remembered as the mess. But in Portuguese, a table was something like cefidra, spelt phonetically, while a mesa was a chair to go under it. In the gatehouse of the commercial fishing port, there was a bored security guard who told me the language was quite easy for English people to learn, but Chinese people had problems producing the sounds of the words. He demonstrated a Chinese person by squinting his eyes, puckering his nose and drawing back his cheeks to make him appear to have just 2 large buck teeth. I couldn't help erupting in laughter at the facile racial stereotype. For several weeks my breakfast bun was only known as a bolo, but gradually I learned to produce strange sounds by running difficult new noises through my mouth and throat until they became easier. Bolo was promoted to an ergvaarder. Note on bolos. A bolo is a treat. An ergvaarder is a specific treat I took a liking to, being cheap, simple and easy to down with a coffee. I referred to the ergvaarder with various spellings as my impressions altered from town to town with different local accents. Sometimes I described the way ergvaarder was written on menu boards, which also differed with the locality. pasteleria girl was teaching me well. Bom dia, ergfara y café con leite, por favor. Good morning, a round sweet bread coated with coconut and coffee with milk, please. The Penicienses liked to communicate. It was part of their joie de vivre. A woman pointed at my coffee and ergfara as she left the pasteleria and told me not to let it get cold. But I was absorbed in thought and had hardly touched my breakfast in 20 minutes. Older people often leapt the communication gap between strangers, saying "Bom dia," and a passing face beamed with existential joy. On the way to the library, a man was always on his tiled balcony. "Bom dia!" he always called over the road, and I was lifted out of a state of civil inattention into a warm greeting. Fishermen and ex-fishermen clustered around the bars along the road by the tidal river eyed me sceptically as a foreigner, alone, female, a yachty. Yet there was often a greeting if I caught someone's eye, or the sun was out. The sun burnt off recent rain, and a cold wind carried the rain clouds down towards Lisbon. Many days I noticed the weather in Peniche was very similar to that in Faro, in the Algarve. The sea was just 1 degree colder here. The air temperature was the same at 15 degrees centigrade, and there was rain forecast in both places. A full moon must have put the muse of self-steering wind vanes in a good mood. I made good progress with improvements. Also in attendance was the muse of geometry, who brought ideas to solve problems with angles and forces. Reducing friction to the minimum and increasing power transmission between the wind vane signal and the big part in the water would eventually make it work. Having started building it in Bristol meant it was relatively easy to improve on it now. The lower part was more difficult because I had not seen any plywood for sale. I had been told to visit the large fishing boatyard on the far side of the harbour. This was a hike, so I waited for clearer weather to go there. I had reservations about hanging an extra rudder because I was aware of the extreme forces which affect the hull when waves hit the stern. If the rudder failed and became twisted into a bad position, it would cause difficulties I would rather do without. So the rudder had to be a success by building it strong enough and getting the design right. A French yachtsman set off southwards, making for Sines. 100 miles south, he had a proper wind vane, self-steering device. Darkness came early, and the nights were long and cold. A long trip would be safer and more likely if I was able to sit under the spray hood and keep watch, without having to sit steering in the cockpit. On a map, Cabo Caveiro looked like a large wart attached to the occidental coastline of Portugal. I walked out of the internet cafe into a very warm sunshine. It was so warm I took a right turn instead of the usual left to go back to the harbour. I wondered about the chance of seeing a gecko. Past the usual urban sprawl of flats and housing, interspersed with patches of neglected homesteads from an earlier period. Dry stone walls tumbled in sections to reveal tall thickets of jade-coloured cane. The ruins of tiny cottages rested among these small holdings, and piles of dumped household waste spread out from the broken sections of boundary. I dared not go gecko hunting inside these annexed territories, because they were amongst residential areas. Children sat on doorsteps accompanied by sharp-faced little dogs. Old fishermen passed by on scooters, always with carrier bags hanging from the handlebars. Fluffy clouds moved inland from the Atlantic, gazing down at Portugal, a new shore after 3,000 miles of ocean. Wall lizards waited in torpor between lintels and kingstones for hotter months. The road became dishevelled, with deep drains left uncovered, and a fine cream sand encroaching on everything. Cars hurtled past, scurrying towards Cabo Caveiro, or away from it, for I was on the road leading west to the point. I bought food for a picnic in a dark and cluttered grocery store. Goat's cheese, a bottle of water, a packet of crisps, 2 tomatoes, biscuits and a couple of bananas came to €5, and I repressed the thought that I'd been overcharged for the sake of respect for the locals. Bananas and tomatoes were weighed in the same bag, and an arbitrary price conjured up. I was wary of becoming paranoid and thinking I was being taken advantage of, when perhaps I was mistaken. The Portuguese had never given me reason to distrust them, and seemed more apt to pride themselves on being fair and reasonable. In hot sunshine I reached a wide area where buildings and spaces for cars lay scattered among swathes of sand and patches of ice plants. Occasionally curbstones had been laid off into scrub, where building development had been started and then forgotten. Always there was dumped household rubbish, particularly where it could be thrown downwards, such as into an ancient well or blowhole in the cliffs. A breathtaking view of blue sea drew me onwards across springy ice plants, onto a cliff path, leading downwards to broken rocks. Cliffs separated into pillars made of layers of eroded stone like piles of giant pita breads. Herring gulls hung in the wind over the crags, and the sea broke heavily around the bay. Through the stacks of eroded rock, the Ilha de Belenga lay 5 miles to the west. All too salty for geckos, but perfect for a picnic, and I chose a spot away from the smelly niches where fishermen and visitors went to the toilet. Below were strewn boulders, to where arches and rifts in the cliffs passed through to the churning white sea. The stones faltered in scale as my eyes pulled into and out of focus on the variable terrain. Sometimes a particular boulder seemed massive, as big as a double bed, but then it shrank to a mere stone, such as one might carry home for the garden. I ate my picnic and flung little bits of food into the rocks for creatures who might live there. The road leading to Cabo Caveiro had spectacular sheer drops, with fishermen using long beach rods, casting out into the swells from a height of 70 metres. I saw the same scene as in the photograph on the cover of the Peniche tourist map, a precipitous drop with the azure Atlantic beyond and someone fishing at the cliff edge.